Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to a really important gathering here of Fireside Adoptees and Constellation Group for an important discussion with some really prominent members in our community, the Adoption Constellation community, who are putting out a new book on December 1st called Adoption Unfiltered. And I'd like to read a little bit about each of the distinguished guests that we have here today. And we start with our adoptee, Sara Easterly. We like to prioritize or center the adoptee in these conversations because, of course, we feel that adoptees have historically been kind of relegated to the back seat, often in conversations or often infantilized. But we recognize our adoptee, Sara Easterly, here. She's an adoptee and award-winning author. She has a memoir called Searching for Mom and won a gold medal in the Illumination Book Awards. She's also written many adoption-focused articles, essays, and book reviews, which have been published in many different places. And she's also supporting the adoption and foster care cohort of Reaching Troubled Kids through the Neufeld Institute, where she's on staff. And many of us will know her as the founder of Adoptee Voices. So let me welcome you, Sara. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Great. And I will move on here to Kelsey Vander Vliet Ranyard. Kelsey is a birth mother. She's passionate about raising the standards in adoption to better serve children, mothers, and families, those affected by family separation. Kelsey spent several years working in the adoption field, most notably focusing on public policy issues impacting all members of the adoption triad. She is herself also the daughter and granddaughter of adoptees, and she is a co-host of what was the first ever birth mom podcast, Twisted Sisterhood. Welcome, Kelsey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Glad you're here. And I'd also like to welcome Lori Holden, who is the adoptive parent of two young adults, a very familiar face in our community, just like Sara and Kelsey are. She hosts a podcast, Adoption: The Long View, and she's the author of an important book called The Open-Hearted Way to Open Adoption, Helping Your Child Grow Up Whole, which was recommended by People Magazine in 2021 and was also written by her daughter's birth mother, co-wrote it with her. Lori is keynoted and presented on adoption at different conferences around the U.S. And in 2018, she was honored as an angel in adoption by the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute, nominated by Senator Michael Bennet of Colorado. So welcome, Lori.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks to the whole Fireside community for the warm hearth you have here.
Thank you. And I would like to say that it's a great honor for me. And usually I don't have quite as many lines to read, so I hope it was fluid enough for you all. It's great, though. It's a tribute to the fact that we've got all these wonderful people weighing in on a really important topic and celebrating with you and interested in your book coming out, Adoption Unfiltered, which will be a main point of our conversation here. But I'd like to also say that for me personally, this is especially a really compelling conversation that began really with Lori personally, a little maybe last summer of 2022, when I interviewed Lori, also in Fireside Adoptees, as an adoptive parent. And the trust that grew up between the two of us and the friendship that resulted has really given me a great appreciation for Lori. Even just on a personal note, when I went through some difficult times recently, Lori reached out to me. She stays in touch. She's committed to being the best she can for her adult adopted children and is open to learning from all members of the constellation. So I especially feel the warmth of Lori being here. It's a calming presence for me because we've been in this conversation now for so long. It was transformational for me. It would help me see that, yes, it's great and it's important to have our space called Fireside Adoptees, and it's also important to have our grasp and our reach extended as much as possible to include other members of the constellation, because there are important things to be done, and we need each member of the constellation in order to do that. So thank you all for being here. And again, it's a great honor for us. Congratulations on the book that will be out December 1st. I was wondering if we could start a little bit with talking about the book, maybe just a few minutes about, from each of your perspectives, what you think the book has to offer that's unique, and what you feel is probably the most important message from each of your unique perspectives within the constellation. So I will start with Sara, since again, as I've mentioned, we like to center Adoptee Voices, and there's no pun intended there, but of course, Sara is the founder of Adoptee Voices. But let's hear from Sara. What would you feel is the thing about the book that you feel is probably a unique contribution and the most important part of the message that you would like to get across in it?
Yeah, really great question, Greg. I think I'll back up just a little bit and I'll say that just for context, that we broke the book up into 4 parts. So we kind of played off the title, Adoption Unfiltered, and we structured the book with the adoptee section called Adoptees Unfiltered, the birth parent section called Birth Parents Unfiltered, Adoptive Parents Unfiltered, and then we have a 4th section that we co-wrote together, Healing and Hope, about kind of ideas for on an individual and systemic level. So I think what I would say, I'll speak to kind of my section. What I really wanted to do was explain adoptees to other people. I feel like we're often misunderstood. We tend to get diagnoses that are inaccurate or missing. They're based on behaviors and they're missing what's lying at the developmental circumstances underneath. And then I also wanted to explain adoptees to ourselves. So speaking for myself and through the Adoptee Voices writing groups, I've met so many wonderful adoptees. So I feel pretty confident in making a little bit of a sweeping statement, although none of us are a monolith. But I think a lot of us grow up in isolation and we grow up thinking something's really wrong with us. And for me, when I found child development and attachment, and I came to it through my parenting, my own parenting journey, and just knowing that I wanted to parent my children differently than I was parented, the whole context for me was blown wide open, because I thought, wow, not only is this informing me in parenting, but it's informing how I was parented. And then it's informing what my needs were as an adoptee. And I could see all kinds of things that were missing, that were needed. And when I say things that were missing, I think even just insight and perspective that was missing, of how humans react in the face of separation. And with adoption, we're facing separation for a lifetime in lots of different ways and stages as we progress through our lives. So it's psychoeducation. I've interviewed 23 adoptees to present not their stories necessarily, but to distill the larger story of adoption and make sense of us and introduce us to others, and then introduce us to ourselves, and hopefully in the process lead to not only better practices in adoption, but also better practices in our families, and for those raising adoptees today.
Wonderful. And I think that one of the things, and I unfortunately have not had a chance to view the book, but I've been reading lots about it and seeing the views and the perspectives of some of the contributors and the things that they felt were most significant about what they had done. But I think that the issue of science, right, of brain science and trauma, when you mention separation here, the issues this creates, I'd like to circle back to that in a few minutes if we can here, and just give you maybe a pre-thought here of the fact that there is, I think, this belief in society that there's nothing that adoptees suffer because in the case of private infant adoption, for example, you were too little, you don't remember. You had good parents, or maybe you didn't have good parents, but the things that happened before happened in a state that couldn't affect you.
Yes.
We know that this is now a case. There was a pre-verbal trauma, right? There was something that precedes us coming on the scene. But I'd like to circle back around to that in a minute if we can about this. I feel like that's a really important thing that's very often not understood in a larger context in terms of what adoptees have suffered. Loss, not just in terms of our identity, which is substantial and heartbreaking, but also the way it affects the neurological wiring of people and the way each of us individually responds to trauma. So thank you for that, Sara. So Kelsey, what would you say is probably the most important contribution you feel that your sections of the book have made, and what would you like people to know as an important message out of that?
Yeah, I think for the birth parent section, I know just from speaking with adoptees from all generations, really, birth parents so often live in they live as like a figment of somebody's imagination because of the lack of access to birth parents. And also for adoptive parents as well, who especially in this generation of adoptive parents who are wanting an open adoption, but for whatever reason, a birth parent has not been able to show up to do that. And so what happens is, our imagination replaces the reality of this person. And I know it's often referred to as the ghost kingdom for a child's imagination to fill that gap of unknown. And so I think what I wanted to do with my section is to give that person wholeness and bring life to that person, because she's very real, and also bring understanding to her, and help people realize her humanity.
That was really wonderful. And I feel like as soon as you started speaking, I wrote down lack of access to first parents. I've never thought of that. And these are the reasons the conversation has to go outward and expand more in the constellation, because I think adoptees know that we have a lack of access. I'm not sure I've heard anyone from the first parent perspective talk about that. And that was really compelling for me. It really seized me as it is. There's a lack of access, and you are feeling it from your side profoundly as well. Thank you so much. Lori, would you like to talk about the most important contribution of the work as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, Sara has been able to say this so succinctly, so I'm going to copy her, which is basically my first thought was to help adoptive parents understand themselves, because there's such a lack of critical thinking about adoption for most people coming into it. I think adoptive parents are the ones that opt in out of choice, opt into the adoption arena because of they want to, unlike the rest that my counterparts. And we coast in there based on what we know, what's out in the world. And there's not a lot of critical thinking about what there is out in the world. And so much of it is leftover bad information, stale information from the closed adoption era, even though we've been in the open adoption era for so many decades. So part of it is to help people start to think and self-reflect and take a look at the long view of parenting, not just the journey of getting a baby. The other thing I wanted to do is, as Sara also said, show us to each other in the triad. Online, there's in order for me to listen to adoptees and birth parents, I frequent a lot of cross-triad places, especially ones that elevate other voices. And there are sometimes a lot of dehumanizing things said in there. And just as adoptees and birth parents are sometimes seen as one-dimensional, two-dimensional maybe, so are adoptive parents. So part of what I also wanted to do is to be understood by our counterparts. And there's reasons why we act out of this insecurity, and there's reasons why we are fragile, and all of these stereotypes that we have in the smaller communities, not the big world of the rest of the world. So those are two of the things that I wanted to try to do, because I think that, that dehumanizing is so prevalent, not just in adoption world, but we just see everything in black and white. Politically, we think our side is flawless and the other side is are idiots. And I was seeing that happen in adoption world too. And so that was part of the filtering, the unfiltering, is to explain our warts. Show our warts and explain our warts.
Thank you. And it leads actually into the next point, which I wanted to talk to you about, the significance of the word filters in the title of the book, Adoption Unfiltered. So I feel like there's a very specific reason that became part of the title. And I was wondering if each of you could talk about these filters, what they are maybe in each one of our respective communities. And I know that you believe these are harmful, I think, and that they needed to come off. So if we could start with Sara, what is your estimation of the filters in the adoptee community, and how do you think they affect us?
I think it's from my perspective, the filtering has been in place for a long time. So the filtered story of adoption, I think those of us who are here in the adoptee and adoption community are pretty well aware of, because of I just know by the spaces we're in, that there's a narrative of adoption, that it's a win-win, and that everybody's happy, and it makes makes lemonade out of lemons, and an unwanted pregnancy, and a family that is in need for some reason of a child, and voila, we've got a beautiful story. And culturally, we've made changes, we're making headway. I'm so happy that Adoptee Voices I feel a shift in the cultural narrative coming. I feel it so strongly in our community, and it gives me so much hope, and we still have a long way to go. Just recently I told someone I was adopted, and I heard, "Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful." And I'm like, "Oh, there's a lot more than just saying it's just so beautiful." So that you have the filtered version. And so we're presenting the unfiltered version, which is, yes, it can be beautiful. And there's a lot of hardship. There's pain, there's loss. There's all those things. That doesn't mean it's a lost cause, but it means that there's a lot more than what that filtered story presents.
Very helpful. Thank you. How about Kelsey? What is your view on the filters that might happen within your segment of the Constellation?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have talked about most is that we filter for truth. So I think historically, birth parents haven't had control over their own narrative. In just the same way that Sara mentioned, someone saying, "That's so beautiful." People say that to me all the time too. And I'm like, this is the most traumatic thing I've ever been through. And it has ongoing effects that expand beyond me. I now have a daughter who you can probably hear in the background, who's kicking a beach ball around my house, and I'm praying she doesn't break anything. But she's almost 3 and asks about my oldest, who I placed, and she knows him, and she's met him, but and I don't think she understands obviously the complexity of it all, but I know that it will affect her and him in different ways. And I think that's something that we wanted to bring light to, because these are the parts of our story that have historically been filtered through a lens of simplicity. And one of the things from working in adoption for years that I heard all the time was when we were pitching, open adoption, which I very much believe in, but I believe we've been talking about it all wrong. One of the things we say is, people think open adoption is confusing for a kid, and it's not confusing. And the answer to that is, no, it is confusing. This whole dynamic is very confusing, but as adults, it's our job to help these kids understand, that complexity and confusion, and sort through those things. So I think the unfiltering for me was just seeking honesty in our storytelling, and complexity, and being able to present the complexity in the right way to tell all facets of a story.
This is all really enlightening. Thank you. Lori, I think you recently titled one of your podcasts something to do with filters. So why don't you talk about filters from your perspective?
Yeah, the November episode of Adoption the Long View featured my two co-authors, and it is all about what has been filtered from us can hurt us. And the us in that means my audience, adoptive parents, because when we don't get the full picture, we're at a huge disadvantage for the rest of the bigger us in adoption world. And so just to build on what Kelsey was saying, I think basically the Unfiltered is inviting readers and maybe even people who just read the cover to go from simplicity to complexity. Because everybody thinks they know adoption because what's there to know? Like Sara was saying, happy ending, happy beginning, happy everything. It's a win-win. But you just don't see the depth and the breadth of all the complexity in that. We're humans. How can we not have a lot of complexity within ourselves, among ourselves, and then over time with each other? It's just so complex. And to have it so simplified is interesting. So like Kelsey said, we do unfilter for truth, but what we found along the way is we're trying to really set the setting for unfiltering. We do have to perhaps still filter for kindness and accessibility. So, if you ask your partner or somebody trusted to you if this new outfit makes your butt look big, you may want a little bit of a filter there and not the whole truth. But, and so an example of this is I wrote a chapter with adoptive parents in mind, with that filter in mind, called Baby Fever. And I thought it really explained ourselves to ourselves in an effective way, the story arc from having baby fever to realizing the error of those ways and having to figure out a new way to approach it, and then coming out with new wisdom, like a hero's journey there. And some early readers who were not adoptive parents found that way too unfiltered. And so with the help of Kelsey and Sara, because it was at the last hour, I had to rework that whole section in a way that was filtered more for kindness and accessibility, even though I wanted to keep all those hard truths in it. So that's some of the discernment work that went into the writing of the book.
Let's talk a little bit about, this was a big undertaking. I heard it was 3 years, right, to get all this to come together. So at the beginning of this, there's each one of you separate people. Maybe you do or don't know of each other at that point. How do you begin developing a relationship to work together on a project that's this big? It's big. I'm thinking about all of the interviews and all of the testimonies and the perspectives of so many people in each one of these segments here. And you have to synthesize something, but it doesn't fit together. This is the both and that, Lori, you so skillfully talk about in many places. There's a synthesis that happens, but how do you begin to pull together all that material? But I'd like to know how you began working together. So, Sara, what was it like to begin working with Kelsey and Lori? How did it start?
Well, hearing you share the story of you and Lori has some echoes of how Lori and I met as well. So I was enjoying some background and just hearing more about that. So Lori and I met in person for the first time in January 2020. I was at a book launch event in Denver for my memoir, and Lori came and we took a picture. We had the foresight to take a picture of ourselves together, and we stayed in touch. I did some writing for her blog, and you were always wonderful to work with. And then, as can happen in adoption spaces, they can get contentious. And there was a time that Lori had some heat for something in one of the forums, and I just reached out to her. I just wanted to check in. How are you? As a human. And in the course of that conversation, which turned out to be a long conversation, we moved on from the kind of the heat and the moment that we were in, and said, why is it so hard for us to talk across the aisles? Why, I think, why is there so much, heat and consternation sometimes. And so we flippantly said we should write a book together about it. And we're both authors. We should write a book. And it was a very flip comment, because when you make it, it's dangerous when you make a comment like that, because we all know, I'm looking around the room at other authors, Danielle and Linda, like books take a long time and it's a big project, and collaborating with other people it's a lot. It's hard. It has its challenges. You don't often see 3 authors co-writing a book. You often see 2, but three was tricky. So we met Kelsey a few months later at online, at an online presentation that we saw her giving, and we immediately said, that's the birth parent we want. We knew we wanted an adoptee, an adoptive parent, and a birth parent. And Kelsey was so articulate and so current on modern day practices. And we said, she's the one. Lori and I were chatting behind the scenes. And then I think that same day we invited Kelsey and she said yes. So we started, we lured her in. We started weekly meetings, and the first part of writing a book is a book proposal. So the nice thing about that, once you have an established book already, you can sell books just on a proposal, and not have to write the whole thing. So, but in order to write the proposal, they're 50 pages long, and they need an outline and sample chapters, and you have to have a vision and a direction. So just even the proposal and figuring out what we were going to say, I think that took almost a year just to get the proposal ready for pitching. Yeah. And then just, I'll fast forward through the landing the agent, landing the editor part and the writing part. I think, one thing that we learned is there was this, need that had to happen, that we had to go into our focused silos in order to write the book and make sense of our own sections. But then we were like, had this realization of, we can't stay there, because that's the opposite of what we're trying to do. We need to show working together across the aisles. So we can't just say, here's the adoptee section, here's the birth parent section. We needed to bounce off, the drafts and work together. So to say it was a big undertaking is for sure, like, exactly what it was. I mean, trying to figure out what we were wanting to say, what we were wanting to communicate, and then how we communicate to each other's audiences took some time to figure out.
Wow. What a collective effort there.
Yeah,
I
Lori,
think-
what would you add? What would you add to that?
Yeah, no, I love hearing the story, because I picked up, Sara, that you said we've lost to history what that explosion was, where I had been dehumanized, and what you just said is, how are you as a human? And so that's probably underpins any effective collaboration that's across the aisles, is you have to see each other as humans in order to be vulnerable and build trust. So I wanted to talk about the post-writing part, which is like a whole new part. This part of helping, so you've written it. How do you get people to know that it exists and want to read it? And so that's been, we submitted our manuscript, I think, in February or March. So we continue to write together, articles together, to plan together. And one of the early pieces we wrote was for Severance Magazine. And what I've observed is, at different times, each of us has taken the heat. Sometimes Sara takes the heat for collaborating with a parent. Kelsey takes the heat sometimes. In fact, recently, she's just had, maybe she'll tell us in a bit about a bill that she just had introduced 2 days ago. And there's some heat coming on her. I take heat. I'm going to take heat from adoptive parents, I think, for being too critical of adoption. I think I'll take heat from other people for being an adoptive parent, being a trafficker. But what's nice about this configuration is that we're taking it together, and we can, behind the scenes, like, bolster each other and find our center again. Because I won't say that it's not hard, Danielle and Linda and any of the authors. It's hard when you hear that, and it's easier to shake it off if you have other people who are with you, like actually in your corner.
Yeah. And Kelsey, if you'd like to, if not, I totally understand. I know you've got your hands full there doing the parenting thing, but we were just talking about what it was like to come together when you didn't know each other. And it will lead more specifically, I think, in a minute here into the question of trust. And it was the issue that I first faced with Lori. And it gets back to the humanizing element. It really does. Because as soon as I could regard you on equal footing and see in you the humanity that I have, that we all share, and know that your heart was in for the best interest of your children. It was so obvious. And I feel like, though, that it's very difficult. Sara used the word silos, and that's a word I had written down also before that. I think we all know, even in the corporate world, what it's like to work in a silo, but within the adoption space, to exist as human beings in these lanes, that you stay here, you stay here, you stay here. You don't talk to this one. You almost can feel like you're betraying somebody or a cause. But when you recenter this around, well, what is the objective here? I think it's to make the best life for an adopted person possible under the conditions that exist right now, and look to transform what we can. That was what I would say as somebody interested in advocacy. We're obviously all dissatisfied with how things are. But if we lose sight of the objective to say a child, and I am specifically speaking about younger children here for a moment, that we would always wish for their circumstances to be the best possible. If they've found themselves in this situation, they're an adoptee. Don't we want adoptive parents to be the best they can be for them? Yes. Don't we want the relationships to be vitally reestablished with first parents and first family? Yes, I think we do. We hopefully won't have to sever that at all, that the child can enter into that adoption not having lost that. I feel like when we can commonly say, or collectively say, that that's the focus here, regardless of what each of our perspectives may be on whether adoption is a good thing or something that should continue, as long as we do go back to the child is in the middle of it, I feel like we're doing the service that we need to do. I know as an adoptee, I can't in good conscience say I'm okay with children not receiving the best from their adoptive parents. I want them to be as educated as possible, to do the best they can. That's what I've seen in you, Lori. That's what I see in Beth. People who put yourselves out there in very vulnerable ways that you don't have to. And Kelsey, you're probably taking heat also, as Lori said, being out there, because again, there's these lanes. Everybody's supposed to be in the lane. But what has it been like for you in terms of, Lori mentioned maybe there's something confrontational that happened with you recently. Would you like to talk about that for a minute and how that applies?
Yeah, I would say that most of my advocacy work I do alongside professionals, but professionals also include people that are part of the Constellation. A lot of the people I work with that are doing social work and legal work are also, adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive parents. And so a lot of my advocacy work has kind of always been alongside different people seeking change in the field. And for a long time, it seemed like an uphill battle, but I think there's always been a level of camaraderie with my team of advocates, because I think there's a sense of hope that comes from knowing that you're on the right side of history. And so I think that's a good motivation, and knowing that the impact that we are making and can continue to make in the future is going to better benefit our kids. And that's been the most important thing for me. And so when I set out to write this with Lori and Sara, it kind of felt just like another project to collaborate on with other people in the Constellation. Although I would say it was much more heavily centered on the adoptee than anything I had done previously. And that's due to Sara's work and her voice. And so I was really grateful for that, because I do feel like starting this project and really digging deep into this project was a catalyst for making my advocacy work more adoptee centered going forward. We just on Friday, a bill that we had worked on, a federal bill we had worked on for 3 years to get introduced to Congress, was finally introduced to Congress. And it was a bipartisan legislation. And among our endorsers, we had 2 really highly reputable adoptee rights groups that are endorsers, alongside an agency group, an attorney group, 2 birth parent groups, so and some other support organizations as well. These are groups that have historically hated each other, and on some level I think they still do, and that's okay. You don't have to love the people that you're making change with. It helps, and maybe it's a process, but I think that this is a new path. And I'm seeing even in some states where open records, where they're fighting for open records, I'm seeing more agencies encouraged to speak out and support that fight, which in the eyes of a legislature gives, a lot of credibility. That doesn't mean that they're the only credible people in the fight by any means, but in the eyes of our society right now, it definitely helps, and it's a way to use their privilege. And I think that that's really just like the name of the game for me. And so, yeah, I think, I hope I answered that right. But I think that this cross collaboration between the 3 groups is a theme that should continue, because really impactful things happen when we can all come together and come together in the right way, and not to use one another, but to support each other. And when we commit to listening and understanding and not doing harm to one another, then I think really great things can happen, and really impactful change can be made.
Really powerful. Exactly right, I think. I like the word for myself, irenic. Peaceful, right? It's an irenic spirit I think we want. And you're right, it doesn't mean everyone has to love us, but there does need to be an element of cooperation and tolerance for what each of us are doing. So we can, at a lower level, by that I mean you as 3 individual people from each of these perspectives are able to come together, and in a conversation like this, in a gallery with about 30 people in attendance from all over the Constellation, we have a need to build similar bridges as the 3 of you were successful in building, and as Lori and I have been successful in building. And what a big task that is. I'm wondering if I could get a little bit from each of you on how you think we move this up a level now, from an individual familiarity and comfort and trust with a few people, to say now we have the whole Constellation. What can we do? What can we bring the message up a level in order to talk about connecting there? Can we start with you, Sara?
Sure. And I want to make a distinction in something that we kind of realized early on through our Severance Magazine article, and just to make it really clear, because there was some misunderstanding. We are not talking about adoptees having to take care of adoptive parents or birth parents when we're talking about this collaboration. We're talking about adults working together, leveraging power, and those in power being really sensitive to the power dynamics, and sharing them and uplifting the voices who haven't traditionally been heard. I think there's how we go about it. I mean, I think we're just so excited by you know, when organizations like yours and others pull in everybody from the constellation, for us, that's really exciting. And we hope that we're modeling how to do it. It's not always easy. I mean, we rub up on each other. In the course of writing the book, we had adoption dynamics that and we still do. They come up, you know, we were working on a presentation a few weeks ago, and we were typing on Google Slides, collaborating, and we often use Google as a tool. And I was typing on one line, and right underneath me, Lori was typing on another line, writing almost the same thing I wrote. And it was really activating. I felt like the adoptive parent in the room is talking over me, was what I felt. And I didn't know it at the time. I just knew that I was like, ooh, that really got me under my skin. And so it's that commitment to not doing harm. I wasn't screaming at Lori. I wasn't projecting on her any past, hurts onto the present, but I knew I had to get off the call and figure out what was going on. And then later I could come back and say, that felt like the adoptive parent in the room was talking over me. I didn't say you, but just as you are the adoptive parent. And so, it takes time. That took 3 years for us to be at this point where we've got a really fluid relationship where I can say those things and Lori can hear them, and she doesn't respond in some of the stereotypical adoptive parent ways of being fragile or defensive or, leaving and ignoring, silencing me. So it takes time. I think that's just, and it takes authentic vulnerability and a commitment. I mean, you have to be committed, I think, to each other and to the vision of what you're trying to do together, and then just to each other as humans. I don't know if I answered your question, Greg, but
it does. Thank you.
Tidbits.
Thank you. How about for Kelsey? First of all, congratulations on the bill. Maybe that's
Thanks.
part of the answer here, is that you are bringing that conversation up.
Yeah, I think for one, we're starting to have these conversations, these kind of deeper level conversations with adoptive parents a lot sooner, if at all, really, because I think a lot of adoptive parents have gone their whole life without looking deeper at adoption. In the field, I think that not all professionals, but I do think a few trailblazer types are starting to have deeper level conversations with the parents they work with a lot sooner. A lot of that is due to the work that adoptees have done. And so, and the internet has become a great tool because sometimes you literally can't avoid people. Like you're going to hear those voices because it's not an equal playing field, but it's a lot more of an equal playing field than it ever used to be. So I think so I can explain the bill to you. It's called the Adoption Deserves Oversight, Protection, and Transparency Act. And like I said, it's a bipartisan piece of legislation. Right now in this modern adoption field, we have a huge problem with unlicensed adoption intermediaries entering the space and working in this gray market adoption space. The internet plays a huge part in that. They advertise on Google. Their ads are everywhere. They range from being outright deceptive and saying that they're a licensed agency to just financially offering incentives and it's all about competing for a woman to call. So this would prohibit unlicensed intermediaries from providing services. B, it would prohibit them from advertising their services. And this is all in interstate cases, which over 50% of domestic adoption cases are believed to be interstate right now because of the integration of the internet into practice. So this would have an effect on those interstate cases. Unlicensed can no longer do interstate cases or advertising. And then it also places an additional restriction on licensed providers as well. because this isn't a money grab for licensed professionals to cut their competition out of the industry, but it is, it's an acknowledgement that all professionals, licensed or not, have a big margin for abusing and exploiting the people that they're supposed to be serving. So it prohibits a licensed professional from making a living expenses payment to a mother in another state over the amount of $500. It requires them, if you're going to work with a mom in another state where you don't hold licensure, you have to engage another licensed agency or attorney that is in her state. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it does encourage more licensed local on the ground social work and legal support for the mom. It is a way to combat the commodification of our children. And it is, like I said, really well supported throughout the field with adoptee groups, with birth parent groups. And I'm hoping that we just keep adding names to that endorsement list. This has been such a labor in the past 3 years. And it's such a niche field, the private adoption field. It's not like we're talking about millions of people every year in this country. It's a smaller number of people. We're seeing about 20,000 private adoptions happening in the country every year. Compared to our population in the United States, that's very small, but we do have a very unique system compared to the rest of the world with our private adoption system. Whereas most Western countries stopped practicing this like plenary adoption on a large scale back in the 70s. We just kept going. I think the United States is a social experiment in what happens when you do nothing. Policy wise, we're a very reactive policy country. We're not proactive. I would like to see more support policy wise in other areas like housing and healthcare and a million other things that would help take the stress off of a mom who is considering adoption and helping her parent. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So in my cause, in my little space of the policy world, my job is to work with all of the impacted groups, adoptees, birth parents, adoptive parents, and professionals to make this space a safer place for people, because adoptions are going to continue to happen. How do we make it safer? How do we make it slower? And so we can weigh our options better and give the kids that are impacted the most the best possible chance to be whole, healthy individuals.
That is some incredibly important work. Thank you for what you're doing, for the summary of that. I can see in the gallery all the applause people are offering and the hearts. Wow. Thank you. Thank you for that, Kelsey. What important work that is. So Lori, let's turn to you. How do you think we elevate the conversation to the greater constellation?
Let me refer to our subtitle, our almost subtitle. Our actual subtitle is Adoption Unfiltered, Revelations from Adoptees, Birth Parents, Adoptive Parents, and Allies. But one that we toyed with, probably our second one, our loser, our first loser was something about finding true openness in adoption. And that was referring not only to opening records and things like that, but also transparency, connection that can happen when there's open doors instead of closed doors, all of that. So I bring that up because openness has become my discerning feature for how I choose to deal with people in adoption, either in person or online. If I sense that there's a bit of an opening for somebody, then I will engage and try. I put my energy there. And if I'm in a closed space where they tend to be more binary, you're with me or you're against me, or all of those people are idiots, those things, I take my energy out of there. So I'm always so much more comfortable with giving suggestions to adoptive parents. But if I was going to just say a suggestion for everybody in adoption world, perhaps it would be pay attention to where you give your energy and share it with open people and defend openness, defend transparency, defend people who are doing the work of diving into complexity. Avoid simplicity, leave those spaces, or if you can influence in those spaces, that's great. Stay in those spaces. I'm in a few adoption groups that are closed, and I try to, in the way that I can, put my influence there. It's not always met well, but that's, I know sometimes I can catch people in a moment of openness, and that's why I stay.
Yeah, for everything that's been said here about this. That this is why Fireside Adoptees, why our visionary here, Amanda Baum, had the foresight to say we need a constellation group. We can and should talk to each other as adoptees privately. We do need that for sure, just like each of you in your respective segments of our community need your spaces too. And then we need to know that there's a transcending that needs to happen of strictly being insular or in the silos. And it's not because they're bad, it's just that they will continue to keep us from receiving the allyship and the collective support from the other dimensions of the constellation, where so much effective work can be done, just like we're hearing here from everybody. And you're doing that work. It's really humbling to hear what's being done here. I want to thank each of you for that. Very powerful. Goes beyond just what's in the book, obviously, right? The book is a centerpiece of a lot of things coming together, and the digesting of it, but also represents a movement, a collective movement that's happening. And I think, Sara, you mentioned that too. You see the voices coming out. You see people rising up. I'm still pretty new in the community, only a couple of years, but I've seen it, even being in it the little bit of time that I've been in. And we have authors on here. Their books have come out within the last couple of years, have untold other stories, have the perspectives broadening across the constellation. So the conversations like this, I feel, are just really important. I want to thank each one of you for that. I did want to quickly go back just for a minute about this question of science and trauma, and the difference between, let's say, someone who's experienced trauma and pathology, which is a big distinction here, right? The fact that if something has happened to you, that's very different than there's something wrong with you. I wanted to just have maybe each of you say a minute about, because there was a sentence I read on the website that the other members of the constellation are hurting too. So let's hear a little bit from each of you about what is the pain like in each one of these areas of the constellation. So maybe start with you, Sara.
Yeah, I think one thing, and can I share my screen for just a second? Can I pull up a slide? Would that be okay?
Let's try it.
Okay, I'll see if I have the rights. If not, it's okay. But I want to share. Oh, it's going to let me. Okay. Can you see? Okay.
Yes.
So I'm really fortunate that Dr. Gordon Neufeld, who is not just a best-selling author, but really kind of a very leading expert of child development and attachment science. I've just been really lucky that I've been able to work under him. And so this is not my model, but this is my illustration of his model. And that's just the emotional responses to facing separation. And this applies to all humans, but I think it's really relevant for adoptees. Just the amount of stress that goes through our minds when we're faced with separation, and more importantly, our emotions. So because it's unavoidable. So there's what he calls pursuit. And then its opposite is defensive detachment. And pursuit are things like compliancy, people pleasing, presenting a false sense of self, keeping secrets. I will say just a little flag for a little bit, like part of the filtering that, and the unfiltering, I think for many adoptees, we grow up feeling like we have to keep secrets. And we filter what we share and where we share it and how we share it. So it's being aware of that. And I think unfortunately that helps perpetuate problems. So that's pursuit at a really high level. And defensive detachment, resisting closeness, backing out of relationships, shyness in reverse can be defensive detachment. So those are just some of the science things that when we talk about the science of what happens. Alarm. I write a lot about just the alarm that adoptees experience emotionally. Shame's tied into that, a sense of separateness from the people that we're living with or who are raising us. Knowing that we're keeping those secrets can be alarming, and feeling a lack of control over our lives, the isolation. There's racial isolation for transracial and interracial adoptees, cultural isolation, emotional isolation for all adoptees, those kinds of things. And then frustration. There's a lot of frustration that we are bearing and that's in us. Not living with our biological families, not feeling invited by our first attachments, even if it's an open adoption, we may not feel invited. Not having control over our adoption stories, because sometimes just standing with our families says what our adoption says. It screams adoption story. Feeling different, just not feeling control over our fates. There's just a lot we have to be frustrated with. And then on the adult side, for adults, not having access to your birth records and your origin stories. And I know parenting children who are biological to me, knowing my kids still want to hear the stories of their birth. They want to know where they came from, and it's a human need, and we don't grow up with that. So there's just a lot we have to be frustrated about. And all three of those emotions can be cycling through one another and bouncing off of each other a lot. And I think the pain resides in people not being aware of that. The people who are raising us, and around us or living with us, loving us, not being aware of how this is happening, and not welcoming our full range of emotions, and not helping us drain the frustration, not helping us to find rest so that we're not feeling the alarm, and not taking our natural instincts personally. So for me, I guess that's just what I would say, kind of where the adoptee pain really ultimately lies, is in those emotional responses, and then how those emotional responses are misunderstood. And we see, we get diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder, or, any number of diagnoses that are, sometimes those diagnoses do manifest, but why? And so that's why I really like developmentalism versus behaviorism, because I think it's really important to make the distinction and know what's going on. So when we know what's going on, we have eyes to see, and those eyes affect how we react. And we, in this case, is the parents who are raising us.
Developmentalism versus behaviorism. Writing that down. That was a really helpful slide, and the way you described it was, I think, it described for me, just I can see myself all over the place in there, and I feel like that's common for us, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Sara. Kelsey, would you like to speak real quickly about how does?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the pain for birth parents, I think we have that clear memory a lot of times of that separation. The time in the hospital is and many of us do relinquish in the hospital, although not everyone does. But for probably the majority of birth moms, I think that memory. Sorry, Kelly, just sit. You're fine. That memory of that separation is hard, and a lot of women too, causes things like PTSD, and the grief that results is really difficult, and it's such a unique experience. You don't often meet other birth parents just in your daily life. Like, you have to go seek them out. And so, yeah, it's an isolating experience. And then when your life, moves forward and you go do other things, there's a lot of stark reminders of that relinquishment and separation, and the level of openness that you may have in the years to come can also play a part in that dynamic as well. So for example, just I parent now, obviously, if you can hear that in the background. And so parenting brings its own struggles, but also is a reminder of what you have missed with the child that you relinquished. And so in a lot of ways, my husband and I talk about this every once in a while too, even though he's not the biological father of the child that I placed for adoption. It does a lot of times feel like there's like a missing person in our house, that there should be another bed, and that there should be another closet with his clothes, and another pair of soccer cleats at the door, and stuff like that. So I think that gap and emptiness is felt, and I think there's two sides of that too. I think there's pain in that, and then there's almost like a memorial of that. Like, it's an important gap. I don't want to forget that. I don't want that to go away, because he's not going to fill it at this time, but I want it to remain, because no one's going to come and replace it.
Wow, it's very heavy. Thank you, Kelsey. Go ahead, Lori. I'd like to hear.
Yeah, I'll make it quick, Greg.
Sure.
I wanted the pain for adoptive parents, I think, can be exemplified with Adoption in the Longview episode 407, in which you were my guest, and you vulnerably shared some of the things that were painful for your parents, for you, and became painful for you. And I think what that boils down to is sometimes where our insecurity comes from is the existence of another birth parent, but where of another set of parents. And where our fragility comes from is if there's something that we can't tolerate, but it exists, what we do is deny it. And if we can't tolerate that our child has suffered this separation, then we deny it, because that would mean we'd have to do something about it. And so we don't see our child for who they are, and we don't see, we're so worried that they might be hurt that we do everything we can to keep them from feeling hurt, which is the antithesis to healing. As Sara says so well in her section of the book, feeling and grieving is the way we get to healing. So when we are so fragile that we can't tolerate our child's suffering, our child's pain, we can't see them for their whole situation, that causes us pain. It makes us brittle and fragile, and it is just dysfunctional. So if we can see it, if we can stop denying it, I think it's just better for everybody. And so that's why I'm so excited for this book to be out, is we can see it, and then we can help our kids. We adoptive parents can help our kids if we just stop denying the separation.
It's one of those responses that is more than I was expecting, but not more than I would expect from you. So here's where the other guests will not have seen me get choked up before, but you it's a lovely way to put children at the center.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that, even in your response.
And
you could have
thank
said
you
something very different.
I just wanted to thank you also for sharing your parents, and I didn't want to spotlight them because they're like so many others, and they just don't know, but there's another way. And with this book, what I want for adoptive parents is to know there's another way.
If I can speak up, I don't know if this is behind some of what you're feeling, Greg, but I know when I work with adoptive parents like Lori and birth parents like Kelsey, there's and especially early on, there's a low level kind of hum of some sadness and grief and loss on a personal level that comes up for me, that I think, oh my gosh, I wish my family could sit in community with these two, and I wish they could hear all the things they have to share. And then there's also so much hope, and I think that's what I'm so excited about. Like, I'm excited for the world to get our book, but I'm excited for seeing what could unfold in our own personal constellations through reading and identifying with other people besides ours, our perspective. So anyway, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but it's something that I think is important to recognize, because that does happen a lot. There's the joy and the just being touched, but there's also a little bit of feeling the loss too, if it's not exactly what we feel in our own personal constellations. So yeah.
Very fitting way to wrap this up. Right back to a fellow adoptee who understands. So I could talk to you all day, but I promise I won't. So I'd like to thank everybody, Sara, Kelsey, and Lori, for a really amazing experience here, and one I find will just stay with me, and I'm going to want to come back to and listen some more. And I hope this experience has been something that's been impactful for each of you as well. Again, my profoundest thanks, and Fireside's thanks, and for everyone in the gallery who's come. Thank you for being here and participating in this and just viewing what's happening here. And yeah, I continue to be overwhelmed by how much goes into the work that people do in our spaces, and the great care and attention and desire to be as good as each of you can be, as good as any of us can be, for posterity of adoptees today, young adoptees today. What kind of lives will they lead? What will their adoptive situations be like? And wanting change and reform for institutions that badly need it. And just hoping for the future of adoption, that there will be the best things possible in store for those who are the recipients of it. I don't know how else to describe us at this point, but we find ourselves not having agency, but let us hope that the people who end up caring for us have done some hard work and are doing the best they can for us. So thank you to each of you again, and thanks to everyone who's been here for this exceptional episode of Fireside. This will, in just a second here, conclude the recorded section of the Zoom call. You'll hear the announcement that the Zoom is coming to an end, not the Zoom itself, but the recorded part. And then we'll open up for a Q&A. So thank you again to Sara and Kelsey and Lori and everyone in attendance. And the interview will go up on the Fireside Adoptees YouTube channel, hopefully in the next day or so. And we look forward to the impact it will have there as well. So thanks again to everybody.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Fireside.